Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the concept of psychic dampening, which is basically just the idea that your body makes it really hard to charge psychic energy. So as you can see, there's not much on the board. The concept itself is pretty simple, but I want to talk about it in the context of a story, right? So we're basically going to go into a little bit of storytelling. So I'm going to basically talk about when I first realized that this was a phenomenon related to psychic abilities. So like I said, I started studying psychic abilities in the first place because I came up with the idea that the hypothesis that the subconscious was metaphysical in nature. So I thought it would be the best way to really test that would be with psychic abilities. If I can do something psychic, and that's pretty much proof, as far as I can tell, that the subconscious is truly metaphysical. So I started practicing psychic abilities, and or ESP. Did that for about a year, and I stopped because I felt God was telling me not to. So then I stopped. But then later, I started practicing again, not ESP. I started actually practicing an influence type psychic ability, which I may go into that a little more next chapter. I may not. I'll see, because I really don't want to give people these ideas. But because this is not something you're supposed to do, which I wasn't supposed to do it then either, but I was doing it. But I was practicing an influence type psychic ability, and I wanted to do it just so that I felt like I knew how to control my subconscious in certain ways. Like I said, I'm a theory guy, so I was just trying to develop a more structured theory on the subconscious. So I felt like I needed to understand this sort of aspect of the subconscious. It's a longer story that I'm not going into, but suffice it to say, I wanted to practice an influence type psychic ability. And I noticed, now by this time, I'm decent at charging my subconscious. Still not as good as I am now, because I didn't have the full theory that I have now. So basically, as I developed these theories more and more, and I got more structure, I had an easier and easier time controlling my subconscious because I knew what was going on at a conscious level, at least according to that theory. The theory seemed to be a perfect model of the subconscious. But by this time, I didn't necessarily have a theory fully formed, like I said, in the way that I do now. So, but I did have some idea, right? So I had the basic structure of the theory I had at the time. And using that theory, I pretty much figured that I'm going to use this framework to charge my subconscious, to use this influence type psychic ability. And when I did it, or when I was trying to do it, I noticed something very interesting. When I would try to use the influence type psychic ability, right, I would try to start charging my subconscious as normal, right? For as you would do when you're using your subconscious for anything. Everything you do with the subconscious basically has to charge in order to do it more and more and more. And so I was charging my subconscious to use this ability, and I noticed something interesting that I don't think I've ever noticed, right? It was like I couldn't charge, right? So I was doing everything the same as I do normally when I'm charging anything, but I just didn't feel it charging. That's never happened to me, right? So if I'm using my subconscious to charge emotion or charge creativity or charge belief, even though I didn't necessarily always know how to do it like in the most efficient way, like I said, with creativity or transcendental performance in general, I still could pull it off to some degree. Something was still happening. Something was charging, right? With creativity, for example, I didn't necessarily know about subconscious paths or about subconscious organization at the time, right? So I would charge in a way that didn't have organization, so that didn't lead to transcendental performance very much, and also led to the drop-off effect, which we talked about in book 1. But something was still happening from the effort, right? My subconscious was still charging in some way. That actually did not happen with psychic abilities when I would practice it, right? So when I was practicing, this didn't apply as much to influence type psychic abilities because I didn't know them. ESP or sensory type psychic abilities because I didn't know what I was doing as much. And what I was trying to do, I could get away with it a little more for ESP, but for this influence type psychic ability, I couldn't get away with that. Again, if I explain everything, it'll make more sense. I don't know that I want to. Maybe one day I will, but for now, suffice it to say that I needed to be much more precise in how I charge my subconscious for the influence type psychic ability. And I would always actually feel it charging for like maybe a good 20 to 30 minutes. Because in these days I charged like nonstop, right? I didn't know the subconscious favored intermittent charging, so I kept trying to charge like crazy, right? I assumed the longer I charged, the more charge I got, which is completely not true. But I kept charging. I would charge more and more and more. Like I said, I felt like my subconscious was charging between 20 and 30 minutes. And then after that, I would feel like it would just stop. It would just go off a cliff, right? And I would feel myself charging less and less and less. And then it's like I couldn't feel anything. I didn't feel I was charging at all. And I sat there charging sometimes for hours, right? And just trying to do everything that I know is involved in charging the subconscious, right? But it wouldn't charge. Nothing would happen. It didn't feel like I was charging at all, even though I'm doing everything I know is involved in charging. So that was interesting, and that was something that I never knew how to get past. It kept happening over and over and over again. So every one of these sessions, I would try to use this influence type psychic ability. I would actually take off from work sometimes, so I would have the time to practice, because I thought maybe I just had to charge longer and more, right? And so I would do it, and it's still, not only would it not work, I didn't feel anything, right? Which, again, that's never happened to me before. I've never had that problem charging anything, right? And so I did that on and off for roughly about a year before I figured out what the problem was, right? And I remember during that time, right, I was like, I don't think I'm ever going to figure this out, because I just could not figure out why my subconscious wouldn't charge, right? No matter what I did, I could not get it to charge. It would always charge, like I said, for those first 20 and 30 minutes, and then it would kind of level out, and then just nothing would happen. Nothing I did would cause any real response from it. And then when I would start trying to charge something else, it would start charging normally, right? So I couldn't figure it out. There were times I was definitely about to just give up, but then about a year later, roughly about a year, I figured out what the problem was. And what I basically realized was that this point right here, which, just to read it off, is the body dampens psychic energy by increasing its entropy rate. And so what I'm basically, which I didn't really write the whole thing there, but basically what I'm getting at there is what I realized is that your body dampens, it prevents your subconscious from charging psychic energy much more than it prevents, it sort of provides a kind of resistance for your the other abilities of your spirit, or your other transcendental mental abilities, right? So in other words, your ground state kind of gets in the way of charging emotion a little bit. It also gets in the way of charging beliefs and creativity and transcendental control. For instance, so in other words, my subconscious and my ground state, I don't have the ability to use those. I'm not able to use those abilities in a transcendental way, right? I have to charge my subconscious using my mind. My subconscious enters this excited state, and then as that charges more and more, and again, there's also passive memory and my short-term memory, which creates pressure in terms of my mood. That allows me to use a transcendental mental ability. But the ground state offers you could think of it as a degree of resistance in a way, but as it charges more, that resistance drops. However, and this is what I learned, psychic abilities are different, right? The ground state doesn't just prevent psychic abilities a little bit like it does your other abilities. It prevents it a lot, right? So, and that was the problem. I kept assuming that my subconscious could charge for a psychic ability the exact same way it charges for other abilities. But that's not true. Psychic abilities are blocked way more, or they're dampened way more than your other abilities. So you can't just charge it or expect it to charge in the same way as the other abilities, which I didn't know that at the time. And like I said, it was when I was practicing an influence type psychic ability for basically a whole year, is when I finally realized that difference, right? So, and what's really happening is, so we talked about in chapter 9, I think it was? No, chapter 11. We talked about in book 1, we talked about the entropy rate. So the entropy rate is basically how fast your subconscious is building negative memory when you're trying to, when you're focused on a particular subject, right? And so when you're using the main charging technique, the entropy rate is not 0. So it is still building negative memory, but the idea and the hope is to build positive memory faster than you're building negative memory, right? And so the best way to do that is focus on charging in intermittent sessions. All right, but again, I didn't know that at the time. But the entropy rate for like pretty much everything else, right? So emotions, beliefs, spiritual energy, creativity, all the entropy rate for all of those things is relatively low compared to psychic energy. Now, when you're trying to charge, the entropy rate for psychic energy is huge. It's probably, if I had to guess, I'd probably say it was a couple times more higher than it is for every other transcendental mental ability. That's what made this so unique, right? And so, in other words, when I would charge for, let's say I was even charging for like 20 minutes, like I said, 20 or 30 minutes, the entropy rate would catch up so quickly, right? And just overtake any ability I had to build more positive memory. That didn't happen with my other transcendental mental abilities. Now, to be fair, I wasn't charging intermittently the way I should, but for my other abilities, I could at least get away with charging in one continuous effort. So I wasn't charging that good back then either, because I was charging in long intervals. So I'd keep building negative memory, which would block or dampen my ability to charge. But even then, I'm still using the main charging technique. I keep going in and out of a transcendental state, so I'm still charging a little bit, even if there's a lot of negative memory there too. So my experience of that charge isn't as intense as it could be, because there's too much negative memory dampening or canceling out the effect of positive memory. But there's still enough positive memory for me to still feel it. Like I said, it's still charging a little bit. But that didn't happen with psychic abilities, right? I would charge in a long interval, and negative memory would build so enormously fast, right, that it would way overpower whatever positive memory I ended up building up, which is why nothing would happen, right? I couldn't feel anything. My subconscious was just stuck in this ground state and wouldn't go anywhere whenever I would focus on the influence type psychic ability. Now, when I switch to another subject, which is could be anything else, if I'm charging emotion or creativity or belief, then it starts charging normally, right? Because the negative memory is associated with the target or the subject of what I was trying to use an influence type psychic ability on. The moment I focus on it and start trying to charge psychic energy, negative memory would build enormously fast, and then it'll just stay there. So now I can't use it at all, right, while I'm focused on this thing, which is why after about 20 minutes, right, I just could not charge at all or feel anything at all. And again, I never knew. At that time, I didn't know about positive memory or negative memory or any of that. I hadn't developed that part of the theory yet. But still referring to that idea, that's the only way I know how to word it now, is I never knew that anything could build negative memory so incredibly fast, right? I just assumed everything built negative memory at the same rate as all of my other abilities. But that's not true for psychic abilities, right? They build entropy, or their entropy rate is extremely high, and negative memory builds up so quickly that even the main charging technique, you just won't be able to build enough positive memory to outpace it. You can't. If you try, you're just going to build up so much negative memory that you're just not going to be able to use your psychic abilities. And so ultimately what it means is that your body has a vested interest in basically blocking your psychic abilities. It'll let you, when your body charges its ground state, right? When the body charges your subconscious at the ground state level, it'll still allow your mind to use intention to push your subconscious into its excited state so that it could charge, right? And you could build up positive memory in your short-term memory or in your subconscious memory in general. It'll allow you to produce intention to push your subconscious in an excited state relatively easily for all your other transcendental mental abilities. But for psychic energy, your psychic abilities, it doesn't let you do it that easily at all. It specifically blocks that particular ability like crazy. You can still enter an excited state, but it builds, like I said, it builds negative memory so fast that it will just prevent you from entering it again later. So like I said, your body has a vested interest in blocking this specific ability versus your other abilities. And I believe that's designed by God, right? It is, to engage with our purpose in life, right, we need these abilities turned off or toned down, right? So our third eye has to be toned down so we don't have access to all knowledge, and that allows us to engage with the purpose of life. So this isn't an accident, right? This is specifically part of God's design. Our body is supposed to stop us from charging psychic abilities. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Like I said, some people who are born with the gift of using psychic abilities, their body doesn't dampen psychic abilities as much. So when they just focus on stuff or try to know things, that particular part of their subconscious charges more naturally, much more naturally than everyone else. And so they would notice their psychic abilities it would feel like a normal ability to them, which would be different from everyone else. I suppose that could also happen if someone has a generational curse. That would be more annoying, but I'd have to think about that one. But yeah, people who have this ability naturally, or as their gift, their body is not blocking it as much, right? And they just have access to their psychic abilities the same as other transcendental abilities. But for most of us, this is blocking our ability to use subconscious. For most of us, our body blocks our ability to use psychic energy, and so it's like it's almost like it's basically just like a block on it, or I was going to say a filter. So your body basically has a filter on your subconscious that lets all your other transcendental mental abilities kind of go through and charge up, but it prevents the psychic one from coming through and charging up. So when I produce certain intentions and I cause my subconscious to charge, and I focus on different things in the world, my subconscious still has the ability to express itself in the form of sensing, right, through my imagination, through my mind, for things I focus on, but it's blocked so much that eventually my mind just gets used to thinking in a way that's not based on that particular phenomenon. Now, basically, when I'm really referring to that, I'm actually going to talk a little more about that later. That has to do with using your intention to sense something versus creating, right? We basically get used to just not using our intention to sense things because nothing ever happens, right, when we do. And so it doesn't really feel like anything's happening because of this phenomenon here. Your subconscious is your body is blocking your subconscious from charging in the specific way that it does when you produce a sense intention. And so we get so used to that I think we just stop focusing on sense intentions as our subconscious starts to charge and compel us to think in a certain way, and it makes it easy for us to think in a way that's not related to using a sense intention. And so that kind of makes it so that we're not really producing intention in a way that would charge psychic energy, right? So we just get used to it after a while, presumably even when we're babies. And so all of that works to dampen our ability to use psychic abilities. But yeah, so learning how to charge your subconscious to use a psychic ability, to do that, you have to learn how to get around this dampening problem, right? So this is the biggest problem when it comes to using a psychic abilities. A lot of people will try to use a psychic ability for hours and hours and hours, and it doesn't go anywhere because more time doesn't really mean anything. Your body is already compensated for the timing component if you do it for long continuous intervals, by ensuring that negative memory builds up so much that you can't do anything. You could do it forever, right? And it wouldn't charge because there's too much negative memory. So I see some people do that when they're trying to use a psychic ability, and they don't know how to get around this problem. So it's funny because when I did start, this is kind of a long story, but do I want to go in? No, I won't go into it. But suffice it to say, when I finally learned how to get around this problem, which I didn't know this was a problem at that time. I was just trying to figure out how to actually get my subconscious to charge, right, while producing a influence type psychic ability. And I came up with this idea. Basically, I noticed my mind was kind of in the zone a lot. It's always in motion, I should say, right? Because when you charge up, it's like your attention's moving around like crazy. And I noticed that wasn't happening. So I'm like, okay, what I'm going to try to do is charge in a way where I can keep things in motion, right? Which I could go more into the story, but suffice it to say, this is actually when I first learned about pre-charging, right? Which so I didn't talk about pre-charging in terms of keeping your mind in motion like that, because when I refined the ideas, later I realized it was pre-charging. Or later I came to the idea that I've now told you guys about, which is pre-charging. But at that time, I did it a little differently, much more inefficiently, because I thought I had to keep my attention in motion and things like that. But ultimately, I discovered pre-charging as a result of this ability. And basically, that's what I wanted to talk about before we talk about how to actually charge psychic energy. Because to charge psychic energy, you're definitely going to have to pre-charge, right? That's the main technique. Like I said, that's actually how I even learned about pre-charging. Because that's the only way you could charge psychic energy, is really through pre-charging. Or I should just say charging, you could probably still do it with main charging in short intervals, but I think it's best to pre-charge. And so yeah, basically just want to go over that. Your body dampens your psychic energy and prevents it from charging much more intensely than all other forms of energy. So emotional energy, creative energy, belief energy, all of them charge at a they charge much more easily than psychic energy. Your body goes out of its way to make sure psychic energy is not able to charge. And the only real way to get around that is, like I said, is through pre-charging. So in the next video, we're going to talk more about how to actually charge psychic energy, right? Like I keep saying, you only do this if you have permission from God. I believe God still wants me to teach you guys how to do this, so I'm just teaching you. But yeah, we'll go over that in the next video. But that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.